Firstly, thank you so much to all of you for coming. We've got an absolutely tremendous audience, matched by an absolutely tremendous panel. Just to sort of briefly touch on why the Taxpayers Alliance are doing this panel in the first place, we are traditionally an organisation known for our campaigning work on taxation and spending. But ultimately, we are a campaign group, and that means we exist in the realm of ideas, and the realm of debate, in the realm of discussion, and all of those things are predicated on a country in which freedom of speech is one of the key pillars. And anybody that has gone on to Twitter or some parts of the media can tell you there is a drive from some people to shut down places or stifle places such as the Taxpayers Alliance. So for a number of years now, we have done this panel, absolutely convinced in the importance of the discussion. But for the bulk of this panel, I will be exercising my right to silence, so that I can allow our wonderful panelists to speak. And I kind of just want to tee it off to each of the panelists with a question. Firstly, is the UK a safe space for free speech? And secondly, given recent events, does freedom of speech mean freedom from consequences? So I'm going to begin with Matthew Goodwin, who is the Professor of Politics at the University of Kent. He also has a brilliant Substack worth reading, and he's got a book out. We're then going to go to Graham Linehan, who I believe also has a book out, and also has a gripping Substack, and is, of course, well known for being the creator of TV shows such as The IT Crowd and Father Ted. We'll then go to Mark Glendenning at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He is the head of cultural affairs there and writes a lot on issues surrounding free speech. And then finally, Tim Stanley, who is journalist and historian at the Daily Telegraph, and again writes a lot on this issue. So Matthew, if you could kick us off.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Taxpayers Alliance for sponsoring this event, and thank you to all of you for coming along. What I wanted to talk about specifically within this debate is really my experience within the universities and higher education and how that relates to free speech. And I'll also make some general comments about where we are in the country generally. Obviously, if you compare the UK to many other countries around the world, we are, comparatively speaking, a safe place for free speech. But there are clearly, as many people in this room know, many challenges around the exercise of free speech and free expression, especially when that challenges what we might call the dominant cultural and political consensus. It is no mystery, I think, as to why 60% of people in this country say to pollsters like me that they feel they cannot say what they really think because they are fearful of the consequences. About a quarter of all university students in the country feel they cannot say what they want to say in lectures and seminars, specifically because they think it will damage their future prospects. And about a third of people like me who work in universities, academics, say they consciously restrict themselves from sharing their political views because they are fearful of the consequences. So, you know, on the one hand, we need to keep the issue in perspective. Globally, we are a free society, but there are also very specific challenges. And I wanted just to tell you, in the few minutes that I have, a story about how we've been defending free speech and free expression where I work in universities. Because on the one hand, if you spend any time on Twitter or social media, you'll sort of be met with this skepticism around the suggestion that we do have a problem with free speech. But for those of us who, shall we say, hold contrarian or non-conformist views, maybe we hold gender-critical views, maybe we are pro-Brexit, maybe we're conservative, maybe we're a historian who has a different view of British history and the contribution of Britain centuries ago, the institutions can feel very inhospitable, and the culture can feel very stifling, very narrow, and the potential for discrimination and the political discrimination and the potential for harassment, as my colleagues such as Kathleen Stock and others would tell you, is much higher in institutions which are ideologically homogenous. And that's basically what we have, I think, not just in the universities, but in large institutions, the BBC, the civil service, creative industries, a publishing industry, cultural institutions. There is no conspiracy, but what we have over time are institutions which are becoming much more dependent upon a more socially liberal, radically progressive, elite graduate class, which has moved sharply to the left over the last 10 years, has moved to the cultural left, and is often, as my recent book has shown, is often much more politically intolerant of those who hold different political beliefs to the dominant orthodoxy. So those of you who have been challenging some of the madness around gender identity theory, critical race theory, what we're doing to children in schools, which I feel very strongly about and write a lot about on Substack. If you look at the polling, by the way, on all of these issues, one thing I would say is that the majority are with what I would describe as the common sense position. If you say we shouldn't be teaching kids CRT, we shouldn't be exposing them to the idea that there are 70 plus genders, that we shouldn't be telling them Britain is an institutionally racist society, that we shouldn't be exposing them to radical belief systems that have no basis in science, typically between 70 and 80% of parents will say, yeah, I agree with that. So it is a radical activist minority, as many of you know, which is often skewing this debate in the institutions. So within the context of the universities, what we did over the last 4 years or so is organize around the Higher Education Free Speech Act, which is the first piece of legislation really in the Western world that actively promotes free speech on university campuses. And I was very hesitant to get the state involved in that debate, but the reason that we decided we had to was because the universities were refusing to reform themselves. And that didn't take a mass movement to achieve that piece of legislation. It took probably no more than 25 committed academics, legal scholars, politicians, SPADs, friends in Westminster. And it was a significant pushback to the dominant orthodoxy on campus. And the reason I tell you this story in the last 30 seconds that I have is because we are already seeing the cultural changes on campus. We are already seeing bureaucrats, administrators, vice-chancellors now beginning to grasp the fact that unless they actively promote free speech and free expression, organizing events, organizing more challenging debates, inviting contrarian speakers onto campus, then there will actually be very serious consequences for universities that refuse to do that, or which are seen to stifle free speech. Is it an ideal outcome for me? I'm very nervous about using the state to try and get some of this stuff done. No. Was it necessary? Absolutely. Is it helping to defend free speech over the longer term? Yes. But now we need to move beyond the universities and start thinking about the schools, start thinking about civil service, start thinking about the NHS, start thinking about all other public institutions, because they are increasingly coming under the influence of a very dogmatic and very divisive ideology. Thank you very much.
Graham, is the UK a safe space for free speech?
Oh yeah, I'm having a ball. I almost didn't make it here. I was refused accreditation by the police. I had to pull some strings and make some calls to finally get allowed in. I've submitted a data access request, I think they're called, or subject access request, to find out why. But I would imagine it's either because, as Mark said earlier to me, of Stonewall training, or because a number of particularly venomous trans rights activists, who we know by name, there's only about 4 or 5 of these really bad ones, have reported me for spurious charges of transphobia. I guess the other interesting thing that happened to me is I just lost my TV agent because I criticised David Tennant, who I only found this out later because I looked at the list of people independent talent represented, and David Tennant was at the top, and he's making slightly more money than me at the moment, so I had to go. But the reason I criticized him was because he wore a T-shirt saying, "Leave trans kids alone, you freaks." So I said, you know, there's no such thing as trans kids, which there isn't. It's a disgusting thing to place children outside of safeguarding, normal safeguarding principles by saying that they are trans, or in David Tennant's case, non-binary. I see this as a form of grooming. It's adults imposing a belief system on children that confuses and endangers them. So yeah, I'm not really finding it very hard to get a place to speak these days. We've had 2 places turn us down for my book launch, Conway Hall and Leicester Square Theatre. And on top of all that, there were, I believe, 2 TV programs last year called Cancelled, and I wasn't invited on either of them. So I think I'm probably, I think it's fair to say I'm the most cancelled person in this room, but you know, it's kind of, it has a flip side. My book is shot to the top of the charts because trans rights activists couldn't stop publicising it, and so there's a slight shift happening, which might be positive for me. But like, you know, at one point I thought of putting my PayPal out there to try and raise some money, and I realised I couldn't do that because they would try and get my PayPal taken down. So I'm in a small corner fighting as hard as I can and gaining a few little successes. But for 6 years, I have been effectively unpersoned, you know, because I don't believe that children should be subjected to medical experimentation, and I don't believe that women should have their words and their safe spaces and their sports removed. And yeah, they tried to really crush me, you know. So I would say we definitely have a problem. And I do think that you're absolutely right. The main problem is there has been a soft ideological coup of nearly all our major institutions, the police, academia, even the NHS, where the reality of sex is more important than anywhere else. All of these places have been captured, and there wasn't a bullet fired. So I think it's more than protecting, possibly, protecting our free speech. I think it's a question of going into these institutions with a machete and a skip and just tearing the whole thing down, you know. So that's where I am.
Tell us what you really think, Graham. Mark, is the UK a safe space for free speech?
But certainly not, but I'm going to go straight to my conclusion in case I run out of time, which is what I normally do. So I want to suggest today that those of us who want to reassert our right to fully participate within liberal democracy, and that necessitates, by definition, total freedom of speech politically, now need to get organized. We now need to come together as a coalition, as a movement, albeit one with a small m at this stage rather than a large M with leaders and formal organizations. Now, this might sound shrill and overblown, but I believe liberal democracy now faces an existential threat of a type it has not faced since the 1930s. The cultural foundations which maintained political liberty in this country following the defeat of fascism in 1945 are now far weaker than they were. Self-evidently, freedom of speech is now under massive attack, not just within the institutions of civil society, as we've heard from Matt and Graham, but also from the state itself. The cops are now turning themselves into a sort of diluted version of the Iranian morality police. They're giving themselves the right to harass people who express totally legal views. They're putting people on lists of political criminals, even though they haven't actually committed any crimes. 120,000 people, predominantly women, who have expressed transgender skeptical beliefs are now on these lists. There's no right of appeal, and this power was awarded by the chief constables to themselves. It has no basis in law. Labour, if they come to power, supported incredibly by conservatives such as Theresa May, Caroline Nokes, Alicia Kearns, are planning to make it a criminal offence for any of us to have a private consenting conversation with a person who is thinking of going through the whole sex change operation procedure. And if we do anything than affirm that desire, then this will become a criminal offence. So potentially psychotherapists and parents will become prosecuted, maybe do jail time, for having honest and consenting conversations with their patients and their children. So the state is now beginning to criminalise private conversation. People are being sent to jail for sharing offensive jokes on WhatsApp groups. 5 cops, 5 ex-cops are about to go to jail for that. So what we're now seeing is what I call a sort of axis of authoritarianism. It's a very broad-ranging coalition that includes all the centre-left political parties, a faction of the Conservative Party, the banks, big business, and other institutions and civil society. And I think those of us who want to defend free speech now need to sort of form a kind of popular front of the mind, something that brings together people from very divergent political views, brings together the good old rational social democratic left together with the liberal right in the Conservative Party and beyond. So we need a broad informal alliance of citizens who are going to fight for their rights to participate in liberal democracy. So I think there are 2 key tasks this sort of fantasy citizens movement I have need to accomplish. First of all, we have to hold the political class to account. We have to let members of parliament and the candidates of the parties hoping to replace them know that we're watching them, that we are taking into account where they stand on our right to freedom of speech. We need to accumulate sourced material on a whole variety of issues. We need to ask them, do they support prosecuting citizens for so-called hate speech? Hate speech is the most dangerous Orwellian, devious technique which is being used now to suppress our powers of free expression. Do they support public money being used by the BBC, the police, and other public sector institutions to promote in a very one-sided way a particular perspective? Where do they stand on environmentalist extremists blocking our roads, carrying out vandalism against our places of work and in some cases our homes? My organisation, the IEA, has been attacked by Extinction Rebellion. I was glad to say that the person who was actually pouring the paint against our front door then inadvertently splashed himself. But you know, this is serious stuff when this is tolerated in a democracy. And lastly, we need, as a citizens' movement, to label, define, and characterize the nature of the threat we face. Many people in this country can't see the seriousness of the situation because the axis of authoritarianism does not define itself with a label, with a coherent ideology, unlike the communists and the fascists and the religious totalitarians of the past. They won't take ownership of this. So we have to impose a label and a definition upon them. And so in conclusion, what I'd say is that the thing we have to communicate is that there is a very, very dangerous logic at the heart of this coalition I'm talking about. And that logic is based on the sort of postmodernist idea that language is itself a form of coercion, is a potentially very dangerous thing rather than an inherently peaceable thing. And that once you accept this logic, then you believe that censorship is in fact the way in which to create a more socially just society. Let me just end with a quote by the Labour MP Nadia Whittome, who I think brilliantly captured I see there are some people from Nottingham here, the logic of this authoritarian movement when she said, speaking on the transgender issue, "We must not fetishize debate as though debate is itself an innocuous, neutral act. The very act of debate is an effective rollback of assumed equality and a foot in the door for doubt and hatred." So she's saying we're not even allowed to doubt whatever position it is that she adheres to. Alicia Kearns in Parliament, without any sense of irony, said we should not even be having this debate about conversion therapy. Well, she was speaking in an elected Parliament. So we have to, the choice is simple. We either have to get organised, get mobilised, and work on a cross-party basis to defend our rights. Otherwise, the axis of authoritarianism will continue to eat away at our democratic freedoms, and it'll be like the sort of boiling frog syndrome. We won't realise until our democracy has gone that it was in the process of being eroded. Thank you.
Tim Stanley, is the UK a safe space for free speech?
Well, I will come back to that at the end. First of all, it's very hot in here. Thank you for staying all the way through to me. I do not have a Substack, and I do not have a book. In the evenings, though, I do sometimes put on GB News just to frighten the neighbours. And last night, I caught a lady who was being interviewed about some subject, and she said, "In this country, we are just completely silenced." I thought, well, that's not quite true, is it? Because you're on my TV right now talking about it. And this is the paradox we find ourselves in. There has never been more free speech than ever before because of advances in technology and because the state has actually historically stepped back a little bit from regulating us. So criticisms of this conversation right now would probably boil down to, well, you're all saying you're not allowed to talk, but here you are sitting in a tent in the governing party's conference and you're all talking. So it looks as though you are allowed to talk. What I think has really changed is that the consequences of free speech have become far more dire. And I think that Graham Linahan's story demonstrates that rather aptly. We have always said in this country that you are free except to shout fire in a crowded theatre. But of course you are free to shout fire in a crowded theatre. It's just there have always been consequences to that. You will be quietly escorted from the theatre. Whereas nowadays, it feels as though half the audience are fire wardens, sitting there with a bucket of sand and a fire extinguisher, waiting for anyone who appears to have picked up any scent of smoke so that they can douse them with it as soon as possible. So it is the consequences which are really becoming very, very strong. And then the institutions follow. And then gradually, I think the state steps in to bring its own degree of regulation. I myself was involved in a pioneering case of cancellation about 10 years ago, and I was invited to Oxford to speak about, sorry, my editor's calling me. I was invited to Oxford to speak about abortion with Brendan O'Neill. I was there to speak against it. He was all for it. And the event was cancelled because of a threat of a protest by students who felt uncomfortable about the debate even taking place. And that at the time struck me as very interesting, that the issue had shifted from whether or not abortion should be legal to whether or not one should be able to discuss it. And in the course of a series of threatened roving protests, various colleges withdrew their offer to host the debate to the point where we were invited to discuss it in the street in the pouring rain, which I said at that point, no, I'm not going to do that. But that to me shows where things have shifted, but also shows, because Brendan and I were suddenly united by our outrage at being denied the ability to speak, the way in which this changing discourse around talking about things actually brings together left and right and those who do care about freedom. I would divide modern British society into two groups. One is process liberals, and the other are outcome liberals. And the kind of people who've been described already on this panel are examples of outcome liberals. They're people who want society to be liberal, and they are willing to use the state to force it and to coerce us to be liberal. Then there are those of us who are process liberals, who, of course, care about outcomes. That'd be silly. I don't want to wake up in a dictatorship. But the process of how we get to the outcome is as important to me as the outcome itself. I actually like debate for the sake of debate. even if I disagree with the things which are being said. This is why I'm very pro-GB News and why I think a lot of people are frightened of it. Whatever is said on it, whether you agree with it or not, it's an example, a rare example, of the media ecosystem actually expanding to contain new views. And attempts to shrink that, I think, are a mistake. By the way, I think the people who want to see it divide themselves into two camps. One is people who don't watch GB News, so don't realize actually what goes on it, and that its quality is enormously improved and it's matured as a news service. And the other group is people who have seen GB News and they're terrified of it because they're frightened it's going to steal their viewers. So I think GB News' future is probably quite safe. But to return finally to this question of, you asked this, you posed this thing, is Britain a safe space for free speech? And I suppose I would just like to end by throwing a challenge to the very phrase safe space. My goodness, we've learnt a lot of extraordinary words and terminology in the last 10 years. Words like cancel, like toxic, all this just be kind type stuff. And I fundamentally challenge the spirit behind much of that language. I don't think there should be a safe space for anything intellectually. Free speech should not inherently be safe. It should be dangerous. The Telegraph has just published an obituary of a campaigner, a left-wing campaigner called Pat Arrowsmith, who's just died. It's really worth reading. She was a peace campaigner, she was a women's rights campaigner, and she was a lesbian long before it was fashionable to be so. And she was that person who famously tried to drown out Jim Callaghan at his election count in 1979. In many ways, she could be very irritating, but difficult, revolutionary, radical people are. And it's when debate gets difficult that progress happens, because it's thesis, antithesis, and then a new society is born from that debate. Any attempt to impose safety on us, even if it is supposedly for our own benefit, is actually going to retard the development of society. So let's have speech and let it be as dangerous as possible.
One of the themes that have come up in really all of your speeches, at least implicitly, is the way in which things are changing, whether or not they're getting better or deteriorating. Graham, you mentioned that despite the attempts to cancel you, your book has shot up to the top of the charts. Matthew, you mentioned attempts to improve speech on campus. Mark, you took a slightly different view. You seem to have a much more pessimistic outlook. So I'd like to sort of throw it to all of you, but maybe Tim first, given your background as a historian. Are things getting better, or are they getting worse? And are there any historical antecedents that we can look for, either for hope or despair?
I think that things are getting difficult, but I think that's in part a reflection upon many institutions' crisis of confidence in themselves. So take, for instance, universities as a quote-unquote space. Part of the problem with universities, of course, is not just the question of speech. It's that they've been marketized in the last 10 or 20 years. And one reason why tutors are reluctant to say no to students and say you must hear divergent opinions is because they're frightened of upsetting the apple cart, upsetting what are essentially their consumers and their customers, and losing them. So I think you have to see that many of these institutions, the BBC is another example, the BBC can't quite decide if it should be a place for debate and encourage it, or if it should be a place that defines what is the consensus and promotes it. And I would throw into that some worrying developments in Parliament, which, my goodness, if Parliament ever becomes restrictive for speech, that's really very bad. And there is a growing tendency within Parliament to argue that Parliament should have should be able to define what is and isn't acceptable speech. And we've really got to push back against that. So yes, this is a debate about speech, we're having a conversation about speech, but so often speech itself is a canary in the coal mine for other institutional problems, and many of those institutions are just losing confidence in themselves.
Matthew, I know you've had a very significant role in sort of uncovering the extent that free speech is stifled on university campuses. Are things getting better in your view?
I think they are. I think there are two things that are going on. One is universities, I think, have grasped the fact that they have to be a lot more proactive in this area, and that they are going to get a lot of attention if they try to curtail debate and discussion on campus. I think, by the way, organisations like the Free Speech Union have come to play a pivotal role in this country. And also, by the way, the campaigners around, gender-critical campaigners the visibility that that has brought issues, I think, has frightened university administrators as it should do. But I think, secondly, the students themselves have realized they're being shortchanged. I teach a third-year undergraduate module, and by the time the undergraduates reach the third year, every September they will say, well, I feel as though I have not been exposed to genuine ideological diversity on campus. And, you know, the Zoomers, the first years starting this week from Gen Z, born in 2005, they're not snowflakes, you know, they're not sort of sheltered kids preoccupied with emotional safetyism. Some of them are very liberal, certainly, but many of the students I encounter do really want to have a very strong, vigorous debate. And I think they're also coming of age amid an ecosystem that is rapidly changing. You know, it is, for many of my students, it really is about the new YouTube channels, it is about the Substacks, it is about a media ecosystem that many of us, to be frank, might not even recognize. And so that is changing in a way too. So I'm for the first time in a long time, I'm positive about developments within universities. I think, by the way, there's a separate issue which Tim alluded to, which is the extent to which our current higher education model is sustainable, given a whole other array of problems around lifting the student cap and what's happening to mid and lower tier institutions and the way in which we're now relying on international students to try and keep the whole thing going. But that's a separate debate. When it comes to free speech, I think we've brought so much attention to bear around the case of Kathleen Stock, around the case of Jordan Peterson, around the case of Noah Karl, around the case of Neil Thin, around Joe Phoenix and others. I think that attention has actually made people sit up and pay attention, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of reputation. The last thing I would say to think tankers in the room is, you know, if there's ever a time to create a league table, nothing moves vice chancellors like league tables, create one for free speech, for academic freedom. And I know some people have started to do this, but start ranking universities according to how well they expose students to viewpoint diversity, how well are they defending free speech. Because if somebody starts to do that and does it every year and gets that into the press, vice chancellors, administrators, bureaucrats, they take that incredibly seriously. But I'll leave it there.
Graham, is that an answer for the production world and the arts world to start ranking them in terms of the diversity of views that you see in their programming?
I'm not. Oh God, no! I don't know what the answer is with TV. TV is very captured. I mean, Matthew has been and Tim have been nailing the problems with the infrastructure of academia. But I think what we're seeing in television is the results of what has been happening in academia. I know you both will know the grievance studies hoax, which proved that a number of peer-reviewed papers are using a certain kind of shared language that allows other academics to cite them in their work and create a body of nonsense rather than a body of knowledge. There's a famous cheat, Veronica Ivy, his name is, who races against women and usually wins and takes their prize money. And he actually wrote a peer-reviewed paper called "Yes, the Emperor Has No Clothes, but You Shouldn't Mention It." So, like, his speciality is actually in how to pull the wool over people's eyes and lie quite flagrantly, and he's written actually 2 papers on that. So this kind of fake body of knowledge trickles down. You know, when Channel 4 banned an episode of The IT Crowd, they sent me a letter that was just full of buzzwords that I'd heard, you know, to do with safety, fake statistics about the danger of being trans, when in fact trans women are the safest demographic in the UK, it was just full of nonsense, and I would disagree possibly with a few conservatives here in that I don't think wealth tends to trickle down, but nonsense does, and it's infiltrating the whole of society. You know, last thing I'll just quickly say is that the inversion of trans women are women, which was answered brilliantly by Jane Clare Jones, an academic herself, who said, in response to this, how are males female? Trans women are women is such a perfect inversion of the truth, and it's on such a fundamental matter, the difference between men and women, that it can't help but kind of corrupt and poison everything it comes into contact with. So I would say the effect on the BBC is harder to spot, but you know, I will say that they have done everything they can, the BBC, to kind of suppress this debate, from firing Jenny Murray from Woman's Hour to ignoring every major story on this issue. And you know, GB News has been the only people to interview people like Maya Forstater. So yeah, I think the media is in terrible state at the moment. Sorry, I rambled there at the end. I'll stop before I go do that anymore. Thank you.
Mark, there's clearly a problem, but you know, one thing that we at the TPA and IEA are generally suspicious of is government intervention and the role of government intervention. Do you think this is maybe one of those exceptions where actually government does need to step up to start codifying?
I think the problem is much more a cultural, intellectual one, and this is fundamentally the problem we face, that the other side have a very well established base of predominantly middle-class professionals, a kind of new class, the kind of people you've been writing about, who are now entrenched not just in the public sector, but also entrenched now in the corporate big business world. And this ideology that at the moment has no name, but I want to give it a name, is perfectly suited for a class of people whose primary job is actually to keep us under surveillance. And it's a form of power that enables them to reward some people to punish others. So there's a class basis to this ideology. And that is why if Labour win the next election, you will see the power of this class even more extended. So we have a fundamental problem, which is a philosophical but also a structural one. And it's not going to go away. The second problem, which I think Graham has just alluded to, is that the ideology underpinning this new authoritarianism is essentially postmodernism. Because what postmodernism does is to create a kind of firewall between our brains, our capacity to appreciate objective reality, on the one hand, and on the other, it prevents us from actually acting on the basis of what we know to be objectively true. And that is what this ideology is about. It's about us having to suppress our powers of rational cognition and submit to this network of middle-class groups that now control most of the public sector and most of the big business sector. And the last point I'll make, which in a way is a response a bit to Tim, because he made the interesting point about the distinction between process liberals and outcome liberals. None of these people are liberals, and we've got to stop, in my opinion, conceding that term to them. They don't believe in the fundamental rights of other people to adhere to whatever they want to adhere and to express that. They only believe in liberty when it's related to a group or a cause that they so happen to believe in. Benito Mussolini was a process or an outcome liberal in relation to Italian fascism. He wasn't a liberal in relation to anything else. These people are not liberals, and we have to start now communicating to our fellow citizens that this is a battle for our democratic rights against an authoritarian class that is in danger of actually removing those rights if the current trajectory carries on for the next 20 or 30 years.
Tim, if you wanted to do that debate in the rain, now's the moment. So I think I anticipate quite a lot of questions from the audience. So we are now going to go to questions. There are a couple of people with mics. Do the gentleman at the front and the pink shirts. If the questions can be short and end with a question mark, that'd be great.
You talk quite a lot about the problems in higher education. I'd be interested in your views on what's going on in schools.
Well, many worrying things. I've written quite a lot about what's happening in schools with regard to sex, gender and race, and essentially schools are exposing primary and secondary school students to beliefs that often have no basis in science and are politicizing and racializing and sexualizing children. The evidence for this has become overwhelming. I've listed a lot of it in the stuff that I've written, but Don't Divide Us, among others, have been submitting FOI requests showing the extent to which schools have both embraced critical race theory and radical gender identity theory, often through the use of third-party providers who are not regulated in any serious way, who are brought into schools to teach these ideas because, to be blunt, teachers don't really know what to do, so they just sort of pass the buck. And those third-party providers are often dominated by radical ideological zealots who don't make their materials available to mums and dads if they want to see them. The government has moved much too slowly on this. Rishi Sunak's made some noises about it. They should have got on this much sooner. This has happened, by the way, under 13 years of Conservative rule. Gillian Keegan, in my view, has been a disaster on this policy. And I polled parents. About 85% of parents say, I should be able to see what materials are being used to teach my kids about issues around sex, gender, and race. Just having transparency, however, isn't enough. We need to get these ideologies out of the classroom. Right? Because, as Mark just said, they are not liberal. They are not unifying anybody. They are separating children on the basis of their race, not their character. They are dismissive of the objective scientific method. They have no place really within the educational institutions unless you're presenting them alongside an opposing view, so students are at least being exposed to the full range of ideas. So I do think, unfortunately, Conservatives have capitulated on this issue. It's not a moral panic. The evidence is there. It's laid out in an objective way. I and others have been bringing together that evidence. The question is, who is going to pick up that issue, run with it, deliver a policy response to it, and start to campaign on it? Because I'm deeply skeptical about the direction of schools if the election next year goes the way I suspect it will go. Because once this stuff becomes entrenched, as we know from America, it is very difficult to get it out. The whole system becomes infected. And I'll just give you one little example before I shut up. One little example from my world. What's happening now in the universities, which will happen soon, I think, with teacher recruitment in this country, is you can no longer apply for any research grants or jobs unless you submit statements in which you have to proclaim your allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay? It is impossible for me as an academic to get a research grant or a job unless I submit a diversity statement. Now, you might say, Matt, what's the problem with doing that? I would say that's an ideological litmus test that is designed to weed out people who do not believe in an ideological project, right? And that will increasingly trickle down into the schools. They should be impartial. They have a legal obligation to be impartial, and we should be calling out this politicization whenever we see it. Thank you.
We'll have the lady at the front corner here.
Thank you, Anne Jenkin. I'd like to thank all 5 men on the panel for standing up for women's sex-based rights, and most particularly Graham and Matt, who've done a lot of work on this. Just to put Mark, to reassure him that the Conversion Practices Bill is not going to go ahead, I think, for the very reasons that you said, because the government's concerned about the private conversations, and we have legislated in the Public Order Bill for Extinction Rebellion and all the rest of it. I just wondered what the panel thought about the online world, because we're talking here about free speech. I've got particular concerns about porn and access to porn from very young age, and where you all stand on that.
I don't know why everyone's looking at me. But I do have something. I do think something about that, actually. I think there's a huge, one of the major problems that we have as a society is that we never really had a conversation about the internet. I think human beings as a species are different now than they were before broadband, you know? And now we're about to take another massive jump into the future with AI. And the world may well look extremely different in another couple of years. And we still haven't gotten used to the whiplash we've got from the previous advance. So there's been all these kind of solutions to the problem of porn, and they kind of just are accepted. Like, for instance, the idea that the way to deal with pornography and the access to pornography is starting to teach children about pornography, you know, about what the terms mean and what the different types of porn you can see. And it's insane. And no one ever actually said, well, what do we do about this? And so I don't have a solution, but I do think that it's a conversation we should have had about 10 years ago, you know, that some of the stuff we're seeing now is the result of all this, an inability to deal with the trauma that kids are experiencing from having access to porn.
We have actually introduced age verification on the bill, but...
Yeah, I used to be against all that stuff. Yeah. I used to think that was just like, you know, nannying. And over the years, I've just seen the effect it has on kids, and I've seen how pornography has become the worst version of itself you can imagine. And yeah, I think that's a great step. Sorry, anyway.
Tim.
I'm sympathetic towards that as well, but is there not a contradiction between us debating free speech and then opening it up to a question about how we might be able to censor some things we find online? And this is right. And this is the thing with the Conservative Party, is it's very down on woke authoritarianism, rightly so. But of course, all governments, by their nature, are a bit authoritarian. Everyone in opposition is pro-civil liberties. As soon as they get into government, they suddenly want to control speech and they want to control the flow of information. And I'm sure that if any lefties were here today, they would point out that this is the government which wishes to restrict the right to protest and the right to strike. And I think I have to say that so that it's on the record and someone has pointed it out, that there is a bit of a hypocrisy in saying I'm all for some forms of speech, but I'm not for that one. And this has always been the case. After Russell Brand was accused of various things, a little clip did the rounds online of Margaret Thatcher, good old Mrs. T, from the late 80s, talking about the dangers of trial by the media. There must be no trial by the media. And everyone was sharing and saying, oh, this great libertarian, she's marvellous. Do you know what she was talking about when she said there must be no trial by the media? The government was trying to stop the broadcast of a documentary called Death on the Rock about the killing of IRA suspects. This is the same Tory government in the 1980s which tried to discourage the publication of the satanic verses. So there's woke authoritarianism, but boy, there's Tory authoritarianism as well.
Matthew, you promised very briefly.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the question of pornography and children, I have a different view. I think when we're talking about children, we should view pornography as we view alcohol, cigarettes, drugs. We should make it as off limits as we can for kids. And I would agree with Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist in America, that we will, I think, probably come to the place where, as Western societies, we have to remove smartphones and social media from young people until a much later stage in their life. Because if you've read John's work on this, the empirical evidence is overwhelming. especially, by the way, for young women. The damage it is doing to mental health is clearly visible, and we need a conversation about that. And the most frustrating response whenever I make the argument about removing pornography is people who say, well, we've always had pornography in our society. We have never had anything like this freely available at the touch of a button for children. We have never had this. This is a damaging, divisive experiment which is exposing them to stuff that is sick and twisted and 2 clicks away on the smartphone. And I just think we've had an abdication of leadership on this question, actually. I don't think there's a contradiction at all. I think when we're talking about children, they shouldn't be exposed to the kinds of things they are exposed to. And I think it's a shame on all of us that we've actually allowed that to happen.
Mark,
Sorry to jump in. I don't want to cut down on your time, Mark. I just want to quickly say the other thing to bear in mind is that we've gone from pornography meaning to people of my generation. I'm 55, and it used to mean Playboy magazine, and now we've gone from that to what really are just recordings of crimes. You know, sex trafficking is as someone said, if pornography was so liberating, then why are so many young impoverished women being sex trafficked to fill the demand? So it's a very different thing we're talking about, and sometimes I'm not sure that everybody is quite aware of what's out there. You know. Anyway, sorry.
Mark.
I'm very much with Tim on this. I think the Tory authoritarians have played right into the hands of the new left authoritarians who have long wanted a piece of legislation like the so-called, online safety bill that just its very name should tell you that this is something very, very unhealthy. Human beings cannot be made unsafe by looking at a computer screen. This should be a matter of personal choice for all people over the age of 16. The state has absolutely no right to legislate in terms of what any of us here in this room can see. And this really goes to the heart of it, because if you think that human beings can be made unsafe by visual images and ideas communicated through a screen or on television or on film, then essentially you're opening the door to a sort of anti-humanism whereby you are implying that other human beings, because of course the authoritarians never apply this to themselves, you're implying that other human beings don't really have agency. They don't have the capacity to choose, first of all, what they are exposing themselves to, and secondly, how they behave in relation to what it is they're hearing and seeing. And of course, the left love this idea that we're all vulnerable individuals who have to have our lives increasingly regulated by the state in terms of what we're allowed to eat and drink and smoke, but also in terms of what we're allowed to see, hear, and say. Kemi Badenoch was absolutely right when she promised to simply not proceed with this atrocious piece of legislation. I don't know what Boris was on with Nadine Dorries when they were pioneering this obscene piece of legislation. No self-respecting liberal government should be having anything to do with this.
I'll take a trio of questions now so we can get through as many as possible. So we'll do the gentleman with the white shirt at the back. And then we'll do the lady at the front, just to give you a workout, Connor.
Hello, friends. Some of you may have heard of me. I am the guy who was at the University of Manchester, who finished their PhD, submitted it, and was then told by the university that they would not assess my thesis on the grounds that they didn't like my opinions. I tried to start a legal case to prosecute the university for doing this. Clearly, it was unlawful. The main barrier to me was financial, so I was advised that it would cost about £100,000 to get the case to the first court, where I would likely lose, because that's how the court system works, and then I would need a further £100,000 to take it to the Court of Appeal, where I would probably win. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to raise anything like that amount of money, so essentially The legal system and the cost barrier there is what prevented me from exercising my legal right to fight against what the university had did to me. And my question to the panel is, there doesn't seem to be any conversation about these costs associated with trying to access justice and what might be done about that, if anything.
Thank you. And then lady at the front corner.
Hi, Kate Coleman, Director of Keep Prisons Single Sex. There's an aspect of free speech and the suppression of free speech which is quite hidden, and that's what's happening in prisons. At the moment, we're supporting 3 prisoners who are held in different parts of the prison estate across the United Kingdom, who've been sanctioned in different ways by the prison service for quote-unquote misgendering or transphobic comments, and one of them is currently facing criminal charges. So this is more a comment.
Yeah. Can I just briefly ask a PhD student there, did you approach the Free Speech Union?
Yes, I did. They helped to publicise my case, but they have so many cases they're limited.
Right, okay.
And we'll take one further question from this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Gareth Lyon from the IAB. There was some mention before about technology and GB News. There was a mention. Does the panel have any view about how to rein in the effectiveness of the sort of noisy mobs that seem to generate themselves to be able to take down advertisers that the likes of GB News and online platforms depend upon to support free speech?
Right, who wants to start with problem of financing challenges to attacks on freedom of speech?
Sure, and that's a good question. It is like it is literally mobs who are doing this, you know, who are writing these letters, and I guess these institutions and these companies and everything else, they just need to inoculate themselves against this stuff. I have a theory that one of the reasons why the world is in the state that it is because of spell check. Because in the old days, you used to be able to ignore letters from nuts because they were never spelt right and the grammar was all over the place. But now you have computers giving it a once-over and making it look like it's from a normal person. And they're very often not. So you know, I'm not sure. I think a lot of companies tend to panic. And we need them to be able to relax, take a breath, and realize that it's not quite what it looks like. It's not a bunch of very smart people who know how to, you know, the different, where apostrophes should go. You know, it's not. It's people who are just kind of hysterical lunatics a lot of the time, you know. So, yeah, ban spell check.
On the issue about mobs online, institutions have got to learn to ignore them. I mean, you can't regulate for that kind of learned behaviour, but it's fundamental. And I think if Twitter, or X as it now has transitioned to, I think if Twitter hadn't been around in the last 10 years, then many of these problems would not have emerged. Again, how ironic, the place that gave us so much opportunity for free speech has also been the place which has then policed it and helped to shut down the careers of those who spoke in a certain way. On the question of misgendering, this gets to the heart, to me, of the problem of free speech and everything. It comes down to a question of individual dignity. You see, I respect the individual dignity of a trans person. I don't want to damage that dignity. I don't want to harm them. I don't want to cause them any harm. But it's two-way. The dignity of my view of them has to be respected as well. So in the same way that I do not have the right to treat a trans person in an undignified way, equally they do not have the right to compel me to say something I don't believe in and to say that they are trans. And that's part of the problem, is we don't talk about that respect, the individual's respect to their belief, and that taking that away in itself, that is authoritarian. So I think it's about respecting the dignity of each other as individuals. I don't know why we can't just respect that, but also why we can't learn to listen to each other. Quite often I've noticed in debates people get angry about something that the other person has not actually said. We had this recently with the business about that comedian who was on television arguing with that lady about men's rights and men's suicide, and she was accused of denigrating male suicide. I watched the clip over and over again. She didn't. a great big unholy row emerged from something I can't believe she actually said. I couldn't find it. And this is the problem, is we enter these debates assuming what the other person's position is without really taking it in, without really listening to what they've said.
Just briefly on that, just one point of optimism, which is if you look at the latest British Social Attitude Survey, which came out last week, and I wrote about this, public support for expanding transgender rights, for allowing people to change the sex on their birth certificate has plummeted over the last 5 or 6 years. The numbers, I'm not talking 2 or 3 points, I'm talking about 30 points. And you'll find all the data and charts and stuff on the Substack. The reason I say that is, and it's because the BSA says, well, this coincided with the debate in Scotland. I actually polled the issue in Scotland at the time, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and the moment Scots started to tune into that legislation, they broke 80-20 against it, right? And when people say, well, don't play the culture wars, actually, the lesson from Scotland is if you want to oppose radical progressivism, you do want to draw attention to these issues, because the culture wars are never 50-50. Routinely, the culture wars are 80-20 against the activist minority. If you poll people, should we rename pregnant women pregnant persons, that's a 5% issue, meaning only 5% of voters would support it. So Tim's absolutely right to say that we should ignore the radical activists. But I think we also just need to keep reminding people of what the public mood is on this issue, because the more the intolerant radical mob dominate the debate, the mainstream British public are actually turning off these causes. And you see it too, by the way, with Just Stop Oil. I mean, if you poll what people think about Just Stop Oil, it's 90% negative. I mean, they've got worse approval ratings than Prince Andrew, which is very difficult. So there is something in our civic culture, as we all know. We are turned off by extremism in this country. We are turned off by dogmatic, authoritarian, preachy, messianic politics. And that gives me cause for optimism, actually, just seeing that data.
And being turned off, being told what to think. The problem with the trans argument, it has moved from a position which most Britons sympathise with a few years ago, which is one of privacy and freedom of the individual to define themselves as they wish, to one of trying to tell society how it should think and speak. As soon as you flip it around, you go from leave me alone to you must totally accept this and use this language and think this way. You have flipped from freedom to authoritarianism. That's what people are acting against, because the British are inherently at heart pro-privacy and freedom.
Can I also add to that I think that's always been the case, probably. The problem that we've had and we continue to have is the bottleneck of activists within organisations like the BBC who are preventing this, mainstream view from being heard. In every institution, there's always very few people who are controlling this debate and making sure that, common sense and treating people with dignity within, realistic constraints is not heard, Sir.
Mark, any final thoughts from yourself?
Well, I think that the reference to Scotland is apposite, because, as you said, 80% of Scots are against this sort of stuff. I think about 75% were against the SNP's hate speech law, which actually said that Scots could now be prosecuted for private conversations. And yet this stuff just keeps happening, and it keeps happening because the new class, the sort of people, as I said, Matt has written so eloquently about, these people still control the institutions, and the great mass of Scots and the rest of the British people don't actually make these kind of issues, typically, the issues upon which they actually try to terrify politicians and would-be politicians by threatening to withhold their electoral support. And that's why I'm saying we have to kind of come together as this cross-party alliance to start using that sort of people power to defend our rights. The stories we've heard from the student, having his degree withheld, or that Kate mentioned in relation to people in prison being threatened with, even longer terms in prison, or Starmer saying he's going to ban conversion therapy and even suggesting that he might make misgendering a criminal offence if you look at his speech at the Pink News Awards last year. This is all a movement towards a really sinister sort of society. Sorry to sound like a stuck record, but a Labour Party friend of mine, who shall remain nameless for obvious reasons, says that they think the left collectively in Britain is on the way to becoming what he calls a sort of proto-fascistic movement because of the logic of the ideas that are now embedded within the left in relation to cultural equality. Once you move away from economic equality and the idea of redistributing wealth to the notion that you have to redistribute cultural power, which can only mean actually suppressing freedom of speech and in some way trying to restructure the whole of the culture, then you are entering a completely different sort of society, and the people of this country don't realise that this is what we're on the verge of.
Well, we've significantly overrun, but I wasn't going to suppress anybody's freedom of speech. So can I just please get a big round of applause for our excellent panel. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And we will have more tomorrow. So please do come back to the think tent.